I want to take a second here in Romans 11:33. Look at this amazing word, unsearchable. Let's reread 33. Oh, the depth of the riches. I'm in Romans 11:33. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. This is the token usage in the Greek of this word for unsearchable, meaning that it never appears again in the New Testament. No other New Testament writer, Paul included, ever uses the Greek word for unsearchable other than this place. And what it means in the English is you cannot, no matter how hard you try, you cannot search it out. What does Paul say is unsearchable? God's judgments. No matter how hard you try, you are not going to be able to search out the heart of God's judgment. And I think this is because we are time-bound, we are naturally bound, we are flesh-bound, and it's almost impossible for us to see the cross as anything more than a guy being wrongfully accused and dying a cruel death. But for the Father, it was the perfect sacrifice. It was God wrapping himself in an earth suit, becoming a man, so that he could take upon himself the sins of us all, so that he could once and for all pay the penalty, pay the price. As much as we love to shout about once and for all, it's really still hard for us to swallow. Because we accept people when they come to Jesus, and then when they fail, we still feel like there ought to be something that they ought to have to do, because once for all just seems a little too few, a little too small. There should be another price paid. Paul, I think, had that mentality as well. Remember, he comes out of Judaism. Guys, this is the guy that used to knock on Christians' door and drag them out in the front yard and kill them. He's a murderer in his heart. And then he accepts Jesus on the road to Damascus and he becomes a new creation. And he so badly wants to divorce himself from the old murderer that he starts using his Greek name Paul instead of his Hebrew name Saul, because he doesn't even want people to remember the guy that used to knock on their door. But how many of you know that mentality is not easy to shake? You may be a new creation, but you still have a mind that needs renewed every day in righteousness and in holiness. And I think every now and then that old justice system of Judaism would come rushing back to Paul. And when he's confronted with how amazing that God is, that he would confine everybody under sin so he could show mercy on all, it shocks Paul. It stuns Paul. And he uses a Greek word he never uses again. And he says, no matter how hard I try, I cannot figure out the judgment of my Father. Now, just so that you realize how big this word is, I want you to think about how easy it is to figure out judgment. If you do something wrong, you should pay for it. That's easy, right? If you do something right, you should be rewarded for it. That's easy, right? This is the system of this world. It's not past finding out. It's easy to find out. Want to know how it works? Just watch an episode of Law and Order. I'm using a very secular example, but it's right there. It all happens inside of 60 minutes. Crime, evidence, conviction, trial, judgment, maybe even an execution. It appeases us. We go into the episode with an issue. We come out of it with resolve. It's not past finding out. It's easy. That's really how we see it on the planet. It should be that cut and dry. And Paul said, why is it not that cut and dry? Why does God think differently than we think? Why does God respond differently than we respond? Because his ways are past us. They're beyond us searching out. We are so convinced of God's judgments, but the issue is I don't think God's judgments can be convinced of. I don't think they can be searched out because they don't look like our judgments, because our judgments are cut and dry, and God's judgments are always filtered through Jesus. Amen. He always takes everything through what Christ has done at the cross and what that individual has done with their faith in what Christ has done at the cross. And so while we may see something on the outside, the Father sees something happening on the inside. And the Father is so patient, so slow to anger, and we're not. I was thinking about this today. I've learned to love some of you guys like you're my family. And I haven't even known you that long. Got to eat with Leroy and Joan in their home today, and that was such a blessing. And I thought, I feel like I know Leroy pretty good. I've only known Leroy 3 or 4 or 5 years maybe. We've done some videos together and some recordings together, and I feel like he's a friend, and I feel like he's a brother, and I'd do whatever I could for him. He'd probably do the same for me. And I thought, but I bet if Leroy and I had crossed paths 25 years ago, I don't know where he was in the Lord, if he was even in the Lord. I know where I was in the Lord, a long, long way from believing some of the stuff I just preached to you for 30 minutes. Were you somewhere in there too? Okay. It is a real good chance that we would not have liked one another, that we would not have conversed with one another, that we would not have fellowshiped with one another. I don't know. And as I sat and thought about that, I thought, isn't it amazing how patient Daddy is with us through our journey? And he sees all this stuff we're coming up with. And he is still intimately involved in us, even in the middle of that. And 99% of what we're thinking is wrong about his heart. Amen. That's amazing. You see, my point in that whole story was a lot of times we'd have to line up theologically or line up in doctrine before we would ever really line up arm in arm. But our Father never waited for that with any of us. And a lot of us are so judgmental on people who are in mixture or people who are preaching Jesus and grace, but then they're preaching performance and they're preaching works. And we're so judgmental and we feel like, oh, so much is coming out wrong and they're doing so much wrong. And aren't you glad that our Father's ways are higher than our ways and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts and his judgments are past searching out? Because if you left it up to me, it's pretty cut and dry. There's just a whole lot of error and somebody ought to pay for that. But our Father is patient. And if you could have looked in the time, gotten a time machine, went back and met young preacher Paul, and you came back at me with your grace, and you and I may have argued and you and I may have fought, but you probably would have saw a young man and said, man, if they let that in the pulpit this weekend, he's going to do some damage to people. And yet the Father let me in the pulpit that weekend, and I preached. And you go, how did God put up with that? Because God's judgments are past you searching out, and his ways are higher than your ways, and his thoughts are higher than your thoughts. And the Father is so patient that the whole time I'm up there doing all that stuff, all my little smoke and mirrors, dog and pony show, trying to do all I can do to please a God who's radically pleased, and yet every time the Father would meet me. And he wouldn't smack me around, he would just love me, and he would hug me. And he knew I was still 2 decades away, or 10 years away, or 12 years away. And even right now, thinking in Decatur, Alabama on a Friday night, I got something figured out. I know my Father's in my heart going, man, he's still a few years away. Look at him up there jumping around, screaming like he's got it figured out. But Daddy just holds me and says, my judgments are past finding out, son. Let's just go on a journey together, you and me.